The train platform fell silent the moment Caleb Hawthorne unfolded himself from the rail car. 6 feet and 7 inches of hope and heartbreak. Stepping into spring sunshine that suddenly felt too bright, too exposing, he searched the crowd for her face. The woman whose letters had promised a new beginning. When their eyes finally met, hers went wide with something between shock and horror. She took one step back, then another. The whispers started before she even spoke the words that would shatter everything. "I'm sorry, I can't. You're just too much." If you want to see how Caleb transforms his greatest rejection into his greatest strength, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Missouri countryside rolled past the train window in waves of green and gold, each mile carrying Caleb Hawthorne further from everything he'd known and closer to a future built entirely on faith. He'd read Margaret Sutherland's letters so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. Her careful handwriting promising companionship, partnership, a place where a man could build something lasting. She had described the growing town of Cottonwood Ridge, the opportunities for someone willing to work hard, the life they might create together. What she hadn't asked about, what Caleb had carefully avoided mentioning, was exactly how much space he took up in the world. At 67, Caleb had learned early that his height made people uncomfortable. Not in the obvious ways, not with outright cruelty, but in the small adjustments that spoke louder than words. The way folks stepped aside a little too quickly in narrow spaces. How conversations died when he entered a room, as if his presence disrupted some natural order. The careful neutrality in voices that said, "My goodness, you're tall," while eyes said something altogether different. His mother, rest her soul, had told him he was a blessing. "The world needs strong men," she'd whispered during those last fevered nights before the consumption took her. His father had been more practical. "Make yourself useful, boy. That's how men like us earn our place." So Caleb had made himself useful. He'd worked twice as hard as anyone else, kept his voice quiet, his movements careful. He'd learned to make himself smaller in every way except the one that actually mattered. And when the war came, he'd served, grateful initially, that the army at least valued what his body could do. Until he'd taken a bullet through the shoulder at Shiloh and come home to find his father's shop sold, the new owners uninterested in a carpenter who couldn't swing a hammer for 6 months. The mail-order bride agency had seemed like providence, a chance to start over somewhere no one knew him. No one had already decided what he was worth. Margaret's letters had been kind, practical, focused on the future rather than the past. She'd mentioned she was 32, older than most women seeking husbands through such arrangements, and that she valued stability over romance, partnership over passion. Caleb could offer stability. He could offer partnership. Romance and passion seemed like luxuries for men who didn't have to think about doorways and chair sizes and the way their shadow could swallow a whole room. The train whistle cut through his thoughts, that long, mournful note that meant arrival. Caleb stood carefully, mindful of the low ceiling, and gathered his belongings, a worn canvas bag holding everything he owned, a toolbox that had been his father's, and the small wooden box containing Margaret's letters tied with string. Through the window, Cottonwood Ridge materialized from the prairie dust. It was larger than he'd expected, a proper town with a main street, actual storefronts, church steeples rising against the pale spring sky, the kind of place with enough people that maybe, just maybe, a man could find his corner and not be constantly noticed. The platform was crowded with the usual chaos of train arrivals, families reuniting, merchants collecting shipments, children darting between adults' legs. Caleb descended the steps slowly, aware of every eye that tracked his movement. He set his bags down and scanned the crowd, looking for the face that had smiled from the single photograph Margaret had sent months ago. He spotted her near the station house, partially obscured by a cluster of well-dressed women. Even in the photograph, Margaret Sutherland had looked proper, polished, with dark hair pinned severely back and eyes that suggested intelligence rather than warmth. In person, she was exactly as advertised, handsome rather than pretty, dressed in a deep blue traveling suit that spoke of means and taste. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He picked up his bags and started toward her, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. The crowd seemed to part before him, not out of courtesy he'd learned long ago, but instinct. The way people moved aside for a loaded wagon or a spooked horse. "Miss Sutherland." His voice came out rougher than intended, dust and nerves combining. Margaret turned and Caleb watched the sequence of emotions cross her face with the sick familiarity of someone who'd seen it before. Initial neutrality giving way to surprise. Surprise hardening into something between shock and worse, embarrassment. "Mr. Hawthorne." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in propriety. "Yes, ma'am. I'm pleased to finally you're extremely tall." The words dropped like stones into water, creating ripples of silence that spread through the surrounding crowd. Caleb felt his face heat. "Yes, ma'am, I am. I apologize that I didn't." An apology doesn't change the fact. Margaret's voice had gone crisp, clipped. The women flanking her had gone quiet, watching with the avid attention of spectators at a public humiliation. "I don't know what you expected, Mr. Hawthorne, but I cannot." She stopped, drew herself up straighter. "This is not at all what I anticipated. Miss Sutherland, I understand this is a surprise, but if we could perhaps speak privately, there's nothing to discuss." Margaret's cheeks had gone pink, but her voice remained steady. "I requested a husband, not a spectacle. Look at you. You're enormous. How do you expect me to walk beside you, to introduce you to my friends, my family? Good Lord, what would people say?" Each word landed like a blow. Caleb had prepared himself for many possible reactions, but the naked mortification in Margaret's voice, the way she seemed to physically recoil from his presence, cut deeper than he'd expected. "I'm the same man who wrote you those letters," he said quietly. "The same man you corresponded with for 6 months. The man in those letters failed to mention he was built like a circus attraction." Margaret's voice rose slightly, losing some of its careful control. "You deceived me, Mr. Hawthorne. Whether by omission or intent. You deceived me. I never lied to you." Caleb heard the edge creeping into his own voice and fought to control it, drawing attention, making a scene that would only make everything worse. "I told you I was a carpenter, that I was strong, that I could provide. You failed to mention the most obvious fact about yourself." Margaret glanced at the women beside her as if drawing strength from their presence. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hawthorne. I'm sure you're a decent man in other respects, but this arrangement cannot proceed. I simply cannot accept a husband who would make me appear ridiculous by comparison." The world seemed to narrow to that single platform, that single moment. Behind Caleb, he could hear the train preparing for departure, the hiss of steam, the conductor's call. Around them, conversations had stopped. People were staring now without pretense, watching the tall stranger get rejected like a poorly made dress returned to the shop. "I have nowhere else to go," Caleb said, adding the note of desperation that crept into his voice. "I sold everything to come here. Those letters you said you wanted, someone steady, someone reliable. I can be those things, Miss Sutherland. I can be whatever you need." Something flickered across Margaret's face, pity perhaps, or guilt, but it hardened quickly back into resolution. "What I need, Mr. Hawthorne, is a husband I can be proud to stand beside. Not one I have to explain or apologize for." She reached into her handbag and pulled out an envelope. "Here, this should cover your return ticket and a few nights' lodging until you can make other arrangements." Caleb didn't take the envelope. "I don't want your money. Then consider it reimbursement for your trouble." Margaret set the envelope on top of his toolbox, her movements precise and final. "I truly am sorry, but some things simply cannot work, no matter how much we might wish them to." She turned away then, her friends clustering around her like protective hens, their whispers sharp and carrying in the spring air. Caleb heard fragments. Can you imagine? Absolutely towering poor Margaret as they swept away across the platform, leaving him standing alone with his bags and the envelope of money that felt like the final nail in a coffin he'd been building his entire life. The platform gradually came back to life around him. People returned to their business with that particular kind of aggressive normally that said they'd witnessed something uncomfortable and wanted to forget it quickly. The train pulled away in a cloud of steam and smoke, taking with it any easy escape. Caleb stood there for a long moment, toolbox in hand, watching dust devils dance across the empty tracks. He should feel something, he thought. Anger, maybe, humiliation, the urge to get on the next train and leave this place behind. Instead, he felt mostly tired, and beneath the tiredness, something harder and colder, a bone-deep understanding that this was simply how the world worked. Some men got to build lives. Others just took up too much space. You planning to root their permanent son, or you going to let other folks through? Caleb turned to find an older man in station master's clothes regarding him with neither sympathy nor hostility, just practical irritation. Behind him, a family waited with luggage, the children staring up at Caleb with wide eyes. Sorry. Caleb gathered his bags and moved aside, heading away from the platform toward the dusty main street. He had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting distance between himself and that scene. The envelope of money remained on his toolbox where Margaret had placed it, and after a few steps, he stuffed it into his pocket without looking at it. Cottonwood Ridge revealed itself slowly as he walked. Main Street ran straight as a rifle shot, lined with the standard establishments of a growing frontier town. A general store, a bank, a hotel, a saloon, a church, a smithy sending up smoke, and the ring of hammer on anvil. Side streets branched off into residential areas, neat houses with front porches and gardens. Everything looked solid, prosperous, permanent, and none of it was his. Caleb passed the Grand Hotel, too expensive, too public, and kept walking. At the far end of town, near where the buildings gave way to prairie, he found a smaller establishment with a weather-worn sign, Murphy's Boarding House, clean rooms, fair rates. The woman who answered his knock was perhaps 60, with iron-gray hair, and the kind of face that had seen enough to not be easily surprised. She looked him up and down with the practical assessment of someone evaluating a horse. Not cruel, but not particularly warm either. Help you. Her voice carried a hint of Irish, worn smooth by decades in America. I need a room just for a few nights while I figure out my next move. $1 a night, 2 meals included. Rules posted in every room and I enforce them. She paused. You got money or you planning to work it off? Caleb pulled out Margaret's envelope and extracted a few bills. I have money. Mrs. Murphy, he assumed that's who she was, took the payment and led him inside without comment on his height, though she did mutter something about door frames that might have been sympathetic or might have just been observation. The house smelled of lye soap and cooking cabbage. She showed him to a small room at the back of the second floor, bare but clean, with a narrow bed that would be too short and a washstand under a small window. Dinners at 6:00, breakfast at 7:00. Miss either and you miss it entirely. She handed him a key. Privy's out back. You caused trouble. You're out on your ear regardless of payment. We clear. Yes, ma'am. She nodded and left, her footsteps creaking down the hallway. Caleb set his bags down and sat carefully on the bed, which groaned under his weight. Through the window, he could see the prairie stretching out endlessly, grass moving in waves under the wind. He should eat something. He should make a plan. He should count his remaining money and figure out how long it would last, whether he could afford a ticket back east, or if he'd need to find work here long enough to save up. Instead, he lay back on the too-short bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the boarding house sounds around him, other residents moving about, Mrs. Murphy's voice calling something down the stairs, the distant hammer of the smith continuing his work. For 6 months, Caleb had built a future in his head based on Margaret Sutherland's letters. A house they'd fix up together. A workshop where he could take commissions, maybe children eventually, if she was willing. A place where his size would be an asset rather than an embarrassment, where strong hands and a sturdy back counted for something. All of it gone in the time it took for a woman to look at him and decide he was too much. Dinner at Mrs. Murphy's was a quiet affair. The boarding house held perhaps a dozen residents. Mostly single men working various jobs around town, a few older widows, a young married couple waiting for their house to be completed. They ate family style at a long table, passing platters of pork and potatoes and overcooked vegetables. Caleb sat at the end, where there was more room, and ate mechanically. The other boarders shot him occasional glances, but seemed to take their cue from Mrs. Murphy, who treated his presence as utterly unremarkable. The young wife, a pretty blonde who couldn't have been more than 19, stared openly until her husband elbowed her gently. "You're new in town. This from a grizzled man across the table, probably in his 50s with the weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors. Passing through or staying? Undecided, Caleb said. Fair enough. Name's Porter. I work at the lumber mill. He gestured with his fork at the various men. That's Jim and Robert. They're with the railroad. Harry over there does odd jobs. We're a mixed bunch, but Mrs. Murphy keeps us civil. Caleb Hawthorne, pleased to meet you. Porter returned to his meal, then added casually, words fast in a town this size. Heard there was some excitement at the train station this afternoon. The table went quiet. Caleb felt every eye on him, curious and assessing. He set down his fork carefully. That would be my business. Sure, just saying. If you need work while you're here, there's usually something available for a man who's not afraid of labor. Porter's tone was neutral, neither sympathetic nor mocking. The mill's always looking for strong backs. Pays decent. I'm a carpenter, Caleb said, or I was before the war. Shoulder. Porter nodded at the way Caleb favored his left side. Shiloh, Vicksburg, myself. War's got a lot to answer for. Porter pushed back from the table. Anyway, offer stands if you want it. Mill opens at dawn. The conversation shifted to other topics. Someone's broken wagon wheel. Complaints about the new bank manager. Speculation about whether the railroad would extend another branch line through Cottonwood Ridge. Caleb ate his meal in silence and excused himself as soon as was polite. That night, lying on the too-short bed in the dark, Caleb made plans. He'd stay a week, maybe two, work at the mill if they'd have him, save every penny. His shoulder was better now, not perfect, but functional. He could swing a hammer if he had to move lumber, do whatever needed doing, save enough for a ticket somewhere else, somewhere no one knew about Margaret Sutherland, or mail-order husbands, or the rejection that already felt like it was becoming town legend. Somewhere he could make himself invisible again. Morning came cold and clear. Caleb was at the lumber mill before dawn, finding Porter already there overseeing the first crew. The mill foreman, a barrel-chested German named Klaus, looked Caleb over with the same practical assessment Mrs. Murphy had used. You know lumber. I know wood carpentry mostly, but I can learn mill work. Strong back, strong enough, Klaus grunted. We pay by the day. You work a full day, you get full pay. You quit halfway through or can't keep up, you get nothing. Fair. Good. Porter, show him the basics. We'll see how he does. The work was brutal and simple. Hauling logs, operating the saw lines, stacking finished lumber. The mill was loud and dangerous. The kind of place where a moment's inattention could cost fingers or worse. But it was also blessedly impersonal. Nobody cared how tall Caleb was as long as he could lift what needed lifting and follow basic safety rules. By midday, his shoulder was screaming. By evening, his entire body felt like one massive bruise. But he'd earned a day's wage, and Klaus had given him a curtain nod that suggested he could come back tomorrow if he wanted.